Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 8 game from the Chicago Open. Now, if you followed the round 7 video, you know that I lost one of the shortest games of my career, and definitely the shortest game of 2019, a 17-move heartbreak pretty much, where I just blundered in one go and then had to resign a few moves later against Grandmaster Alex Shamanov. So I was hoping to actually have a better showing in this one. Now, after that loss, I did have to play down because, that such is the nature of an open tournament. But it turned out in this one I wasn't playing that far down because I got paired against another international master by the name of Luis Torres. Now, Luis Torres is originally from Mexico, but is actually another one of these you've probably heard me say this before, young, talented chess players that goes to one of the quote-unquote chess universities in the United States. So I believe he's now a part of the Texas Tech chess program and has a full-ride scholarship there. So, there's a lot of young talent around, and I believe Torres is born in 95. So a tough test playing black against an international master, and was just hoping to sort of show something different than a blunder super early that forces resignation. So without further ado, let's get into it. So Luis opened with d4, and I played knight f6, and then c4, e6, and then knight f3 was played. And knight f3 is typically a more flexible move than knight c3, because when you play the move knight c3, black kind of has the nimzo, which is a very solid opening, very tenacious, solid and dynamic opening that a lot of white players don't want to face. And so knight f3 gives you added flexibility against the nimzo, and you could decide whether to play your knight to c3 later, or play fianchetto and go for a Catalan, or, they're just all types of setups if you start with knight f3. So very much a popular move and very, very flexible. And it really gives me the choice to decide which variation I want to go for. I can go for bishop b4, which is a BOGO. I could play d5, which is a queen's gambit decline type of position. And I could even consider a move like c5, which is the Benoni. But instead, I actually elected to play a little bit more solidly, given my last round loss. I went for the move b6, which is a move I think I played here for the first time in a tournament game, the Queen's Indian. And the idea with b6 is that you just get your bishop to the long diagonal on b7, and you're fighting for control of the e4 square, and you just have a relatively solid setup. And the Queen's Indian was extremely, extremely popular in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. It's not so much, I would say, played so much by a lot of players today. I think they tend to choose Queen's Gambit declines or BOGOs or Nimzos, but it's still very viable, and Karpov was a huge proponent of it way back when. So I think some people strayed away from the Queen's Indian because many of the lines are very drawish, and if black wants to be ambitious, that's maybe not the most ambitious way to play. But the flip side of it is that a lot of times white tries to really get something very aggressive against it, and when white is very aggressive, you get winning chances. So, all openings are playable, and you could win with them. So sometimes their reputations are a little bit unfair. Anyways, after b6, I had no idea which variation Luis is going to go for, and there's so many. But he opted for a3. And a3 is actually known as the Petrosian variation and has a quite long and extensive history. I could speak on this line for hours, but essentially the short of it is that you stop bishop b4 check, and as a consequence, this knight on b1 can develop freely to c3 without being harassed or having to worry about double pawns. So that's generally the gist of a3. And white also argues that this a3 move is a good useful move, nice prophylaxis, and maybe sometime later in the game b4 might be a move that can be considered. But the point is that a3 is actually a useful move, and so it's not just a nothing move. So anyways, after a3, I went bishop b7, just keeping my development going. There are also lines where, black can actually consider bishop a6, but they're a little bit sharper, so I just elected for solidity here. And after bishop b7, white went knight c3, which is natural. Now that a3 was played, there's no bishop b4 to worry about. and I went for d5. And d5 was a move that was kind of inspired by the fact that actually white had wasted time on the a3 move, because now I thought that if white was to take on d5, I can actually transpose to a semi-terrace if I wanted to, after e4, knight takes e3, b takes e3. And I thought these types of structures could be quite playable. Well, maybe I'd start with bishop e7 before c5. But I thought that these structures would be quite playable where I'd attack white's center and have really good counterplay with the bishop on the long diagonal. So, yeah, I thought this was actually quite interesting, and I figured that d5 was something that was justified because the a3 move was played. So it gave me options to either take with the e-pawn or the knight. Now, there were more aggressive ways to play it. I've seen g6 before as a way to play it very dynamically. The point is that you essentially play a double fianchetto, and you actually give white the center, but you try to strike at it with c5 or d5 in a moment. And it's actually quite sharp and very interesting line. Another way to play instead of d5 is actually, and g6 is the move knight e4. And the idea here is a lot of times black is lacking a bit of space. And so, as I've mentioned before, when you lack space, it typically makes sense to trade a pair of minor pieces. And this is what knight e4 actually does. It just facilitates an exchange. And the bishop is actually quite well placed on e4, just kind of restricting white from playing the move and also potentially even securing a new diagonal on g6. And so something like knight d2 and bishop g6 could happen. Note that the bishop coming back to b7 would not be as desirable, because after e4, it has the potential to be blocked out by d5, and then it's kind of biting on granite, if you will. So bishop g6 could be a nice active new diagonal, and yeah, black has quite a solid position here. So yeah, many ways to play the setup, and I think that's one of the nice things too about the Queen's Indian is its flexibility. A lot of times you could play for c5 or for d5, and there's all types of dynamics going on with both of those moves. But I went for d5, and then Luis went for the move bishop g5, which is actually quite natural. The point is that you keep this tension on d5 a little bit longer, and you indirectly put pressure on the center by pinning my knight to my queen. So it makes a lot of sense. So after bishop g5, I went bishop e7, just developing solidly. And now white went for a move that was a little bit unusual for me, which was the move queen a4 check. And this move basically took me out of book, if you will, because this early queen check I thought was extremely unusual. Now, there are some lines where, checks kind of disturb black's development. And even there are lines where white does the same, where black does it to white. So just before we show what happened after this move, I'm just going to back up and show you the Bogo Indian. So in this position, bishop b4 check, there's the argument that this bishop on d2 is a little bit misplaced in a lot of lines, and sometimes the bishop actually drops back. And the argument here is that this bishop on d2 is not very good. And actually, usually this comes out of the Catalan, not right away with the Bogo. So it goes d5, g3, and now bishop b4 check. And you have this maneuver where after bishop d2, bishop e7, you're kind of messing up the coordination of the white pieces, and you're arguing that this bishop is going to have to waste a tempo to move again, whereas I got my bishop to the square that I actually wanted it to go to on e7 while disturbing white's development. And note that the other way you could block knight bd2 keeps the bishop on c1, but also is not the most active square for the knight, where you could see here it's restricted by the pawn on d5. And I know you just saw bishop takes d2, but the bishop would actually likely drop back to e7 and argue that this knight is misplaced. And so if we look at that position, and then we look at the game position after queen a4 check, I think it's essentially a similar argument. I might not want to go knight bd7 because that weakens the c6 square. So if I play knight bd7, maybe knight e5 is a little bit annoying, and maybe white can secure the two bishops with knight c6, which would fork my queen and my bishops. That's a little bit unpleasant, perhaps. Now, another move that'd be a little bit weird is the move bishop c6. And now I think the argument is, well, this bishop on c6 is pretty poorly placed, and now the white queen might dart back to b3, or potentially even to c2, and again argue that after knight e5 or some other move, this bishop on c6 is going to be very, very awkward. So that's another kind of, I guess, idea behind the queen a4 check. And because I saw both of those themes and I thought, okay, he is trying to disrupt my development a little bit, I decided to play what I thought was the most solid move, c6. And the point is with c6 is that I don't compromise the development of either of my queenside minor pieces and instead just, block with a pawn and just keep it a little bit easy. Luis decided to play c takes d5 here, and I think this was partially his idea, was that if I play e takes d5, he actually gets to play against potentially hanging pawns. So for instance, after e takes d5, e3, castles, bishop d3, if I want to, play in the middle, one day I might have to go c5, and these pawns could be a little bit sensitive. Now, I probably wouldn't have gone for c5. I think another move that is just as reasonable is h6. And I think black has a really solid position here, just not pushing c5 and giving white hanging pawns to play against. So I think the position is viable even if, I have this pawn structure. But I could see how white was trying to maybe, get at these pawns because he might argue that they could be targets. Another thing about these structures that happens is when you do play e takes d5, the f5 square is sensitive, and a lot of times you'll actually see this bishop f5 to bishop h3 maneuver, which is really unusual but quite beautiful because from f5 it robs the rook of the c8 square, and so it's actually very, very uncomfortable when the bishop sometimes is on this diagonal and is wrecking havoc. So keep that maneuver in mind. But anyways, after c takes d5 was played, I actually elected to go knight takes d5, and I actually thought this was more solid and logical because now I actually get the opportunity to trade minor pieces given that things are hanging. And my real point was that after bishop takes c7, which was played, I actually play the intermediate move knight takes c3. And the benefit to this is that I don't have that e takes d5 pawn structure we were talking about, because if bishop takes d8 is played, now I can actually go knight takes a4, and it's actually black that's doing totally fine because the b2 pawn is hanging and the bishop on d8 is hanging, and white has the two bishops, but with the pawn on b2 hanging, it's hard to imagine that this is anything good that white should be going for. So I thought it was actually kind of clever way to take with knight takes d5 to get rid of that structure that maybe he was going for. So after bishop e7, knight c3, b takes c3, and queen takes e7, I thought I had a really comfortable position because I managed to trade a few pairs of minor pieces. I'm about to castle, and I'll castle before white, and I'm going to get in the c5 break. And it was quite unclear to me what the queen was doing on a4 after I castle because it's just not really, hitting anything. So I thought I was really doing quite well here, and I actually got quite optimistic because I felt I'd already equalized. Now the position is equal, and white still has a little bit more space in the center, and maybe I was a little bit too ambitious because I missed a few details in a moment. So after queen takes e7, white played e4, challenging the center. I think that makes sense. You could also consider e3, but by playing e3 after castles, and once I play c5, my bishop is going to have the opportunity to really wreak havoc on this diagonal, whereas at least e4 you're kind of blocking it. Now the con to playing e4, if there is one, is that now this pawn could be a target, whereas on e3 it's not a target. So yeah, that's something to think about. So after e4, I castled, and white played bishop d3. And now I played c5, and I thought, wow, I executed my pawn break. White's not even castled yet. This should be pretty good for me. White now castled, and I went knight d7, which is very much in the spirit of the semi-terrace. A lot of the times with the semi-terrace lines, your knight winds up going to f6 to kind of replace the one that was exchanged on c3. So it does make some sense to move it here. Another way to play would be to try to bring it to c6, but I was wary of d5 being a move that would come with tempo, so I was reluctant to do that. I could have actually started with the move h6, and the point being is that now, after rook e1, I can go queen d7, and if white declines to trade queens, now I can bring the knight to c6, and you could see now the point of h6 is that the queen on c2 and the bishop on d3, that battery is not actually hitting the h7 pawn anymore because it's on h6, and my knight actually got to the most active developing square. So this would have kind of been tough to see if I hadn't really, understood this before, but there is the potential to bring the knight to c6 cleanly in the structure if you're a little bit careful of your king side first. But what I did is not terrible. Knight d7, not just totally normal, and I'm connecting my rooks. And now white went for the move rook e1 anyway, and this is kind of the first critical position of the game because the question is what to do next. One thing that I was thinking about is if I'm so eager to go knight f6 as I had originally planned to do, I actually was a little bit wary of knight e5. I thought from e5 the knight might be controlling c6. It doesn't even look that dangerous looking at it now, but I just was wary of the knight getting the square. It looks now like I could play a move like rook fc8 and no harm, no foul, but I don't know, I was a little bit wary. Another move that I thought about if I played knight e6 was the move e5, and I know this one looks a little bit strange, but it actually doesn't look good here, but it was something I was considering. For now, it looks like it doesn't make sense because I have knight d5 and attacking c3 and potentially going to the f4 square, coupled with the opening of the bishop on this long diagonal, actually seems to me that black actually would have the advantage if there's no immediate attack here. So probably not a good move. But I don't know. I guess knight e5 was the one I was concerned about the most. And I also was thinking, you know what, maybe I should put pressure on the center. And so I thought, well, if I take on d4 right away, c takes d4, I don't have anything on the d pawn right now, so it probably would be premature to take. And I really did think this pawn tension was positive for me because if I just wait, I did think that d takes c5 would never be played because after knight takes e5, not only does he ruin his pawn structure, but my knight has really good targets on the c5 square. So I thought, you know what, I really do want to take on d4 eventually, but I want to kind of build up the pressure on that square, and I decided to play rook fd8. But this move was unfortunately a gross oversight that did not take into account white's counterplay, and I realized as soon as I played rook fd8 what the mistake was. And the mistake was d5. And the issue is just tactically, I should have been more alert with my queen lined up against the rook on e1 that this break could happen. And it actually shifts the game quite significantly in white's favor. A better move instead of rook d8 would have just been the move a6. And amazingly, this bit of prophylaxis actually takes the venom out of d5. Point being that if d5 now, I can actually play b5. And the point is that after the queen moves away, I have sufficient counterplay on the d5 pawn, but I also don't even have to rush to capture. But the point is I actually can capture after e takes d5, and queen d6. And the difference is here that white can't reinforce the center with c4, as in previous lines where the pawn was still in b6. So the point is that the real issue is not that, the d5 pawn is going to queen in a second, but the issue is that, if white actually gets d5 and c4, my bishop on b7 is completely shut out of the game. And it doesn't really matter that the pawns are on light squares if they're protected and passed. So that was the kind of oversight that I made, is that I kind of didn't catch this in time because, again, if these pawns are protected and passed, my bishop is just not playing. And if white is playing like a piece up and controls the one open file, I'm in trouble strategically. So anyways, after rook fd8, d5, I thought I was pretty much obliged to take, and I played e takes d5. But actually, believe it or not, the computer even suggests a6 here. And the point is that I try to force through b5 at all costs. Point being that after c4, I can even go b5 here. And if c takes b5, I can actually go e takes d5, and my bishop finally does open up on that diagonal. And yeah, the positions actually would be quite close to equal here. Even though white is a pawn up, I have really adequate counterplay on the d5 pawn. But still, definitely not the position you want to play. And actually, after b5, white can also play the move queen c2 and kind of continue to try and block out this bishop on d5. And the line would continue: b takes e4, bishop takes c4, e takes d5, e takes d5, queen d6. And the issue in a lot of these positions is that, again, the bishop is still blocked out, and the queen is actually a very poor blockader. In fact, it's the worst blockader because it's the strongest piece. So if any other piece attacks it, it pretty much is obliged to move. And so in this type of position, after knight g5, not only is there this mate threat on h7, there's also this knight that's challenging the queen as a blockader on d6. And white is just comfortably better in all of these positions. Note that after knight f6, rook a d1, the pawn on d5 isn't hanging because of the tactics on h7. And again, the queen is just a very, very poor blockader. So, yeah, tough spot to be in. Either way you slice it after the move d5. I took on d5, and after e takes d5, I went queen f6 because now I thought it's really imperative that my queen is active, because it would seem that white is going to get in c4, but my queen has to control this knight on f3, because if this knight spins around to a very active square, I'm pretty much lost. My bishop is out of the game. My knight is not really playing right now because my queen needs the square. And again, I thought my queen on f6 is better than on d6, where it would eventually be evicted anyway. After queen f6, c4 is played, and yeah, you can just see strategically how this position is extremely risky because the rook controls the one open file, my bishop is cut out the game, my knight is also not good, and to add insult to injury, the queen is actually pretty decent here because it actually eyes the e8 square in some lines. So if I ever want to challenge on e8 and I move my knight away, I actually can't do it yet because the queen is there. So tough spot to be in. After c4, I went a6. I think now finally catching on at the desperation of playing b5. Like, even at the cost of a pawn, it's imperative that I liberate my bishop on b7. So I tried to kind of set about to do that. After a6, white went rook a b1, and this is a good move, just, you know, putting more pressure on my queen side now that I slightly weakened b6. And here was probably another critical position because I kind of had to decide whether I was going to be willing to play b5 or not and break open the position for my bishop. Now, if I play b5, I figured that white would actually go queen c2, and I thought that, you know, he doesn't have to take because my bishop on b7 is hanging. And it also bothered me that this h7 pawn was being hit with tempo. So I actually thought it would be wiser to start with the move h6 just to, you know, deal with that kind of prophylaxis against the pawn. But now, after queen c2, it's kind of a moment of truth. Do you play b5? Do you not play b5? Unfortunately, I decided to play rook e8, but I think a little bit more to the point would have been the move b5, just because it's so important that I tried to liberate this bishop. Now, white actually has a really good move here that keeps the tension. I don't think a lot of people would actually play. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what white could actually play in this position. And actually, this is the best move according to the computer. Alright, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what white could do to keep the tension here. And it turns out here the most venomous move is actually a4. And this is a move I just wouldn't really consider. And I don't think white would consider it, or most white players, because you're pretty much inviting black to get a protected pass pawn. So, yeah, you are threatening to win the b5 pawn, but what if I play b4, right? It looks like I have a protected pass pawn. It's on a dark square, which would seem good considering we have light squared bishops and they wouldn't be a target. But the real issue here is that my minor pieces are still not playing in this type of scenario. And so because of that, white can very quickly get counterplay in the center and queen side by actually going knight d2. And in this position, white is nearly winning, believe it or not, because from e4 or b3, white's doing a fantastic job of blockading the pawns. And you can see how c5 is going to be a constant target given the if this knight on d7 actually ever moves. So even here, white has a pretty massive advantage. And again, I'm still surprised because this is a protected passed pawn on b4, but apparently it doesn't matter. Anyways, I did not play b5 and instead went for the move rook e8. And after rook e8, I do get, some counterplay on the e-file, but now white gets to play rook takes c8, rook takes c8, and a4. And you could see here, like, he still has this permanent clamp, it seems, on the queen side, which gives him a very comfortable advantage. So, yeah, very, very, very nice play by white so far. I now went for the move rook b8, kind of deciding, you know what, I probably should kind of hunker down and just try to defend b6 best I could. One thing I was really wary of was the move bishop f5, so I thought with rook b8, I'm actually preparing bishop c8, from which my bishop can guard the knight on d7, and my rook can reinforce the pawn on b6. The computer actually wants to play a5, and I could understand why. I fixed the pawn on a light square on a4, and even though I have this backward pawn on b6, at least I might have counterplay on a4 at some juncture. And maybe in some dream scenario, I know this is extremely unrealistic, but maybe in some dream scenario there's a knight b8, a6, b4 maneuver where all of a sudden my backward pawn is not a big issue. But I don't know, I just find this hard to believe that, even after a5, white can play a move like queen b3, putting any end to my knight maneuvering anywhere because b6 is hanging. And after bishop a6, I also have to stop the queen from infiltrating on b5. So, yeah, it's a tough position regardless. Again, instead, after a4, I went rook b8. White actually went h3, which is actually a very, very nice prophylactic move, giving the king an escape square, and also just kind of asking black, what am I doing? Because it's very difficult to make moves here. And now after h3, I went queen d6, trying to blockade the d5 pawn, but more importantly, actually move my knight to f6 to ultimately free my bishop on b7 and actually go to c8. So essentially, what I was trying to do is free up my minor pieces, and from here I can hardly move. Like, my knight again can't move to e5 because after a trade on e5, b6 is hanging. My bishop on b7 really does only a c8 for now. So I thought queen d6 at least begins to try and course correct my pieces with knight f6 and bishop c8. White is actually very, very close to winning here, though, because it's actually hard to imagine that I could maneuver so cleanly to all these squares without white getting counterplay on the king side first. And so here is actually a really, really critical position where white has the opportunity to kind of seize the initiative and distract me from my plan. And unfortunately for Luis, he missed the mark. Now, in my opinion, the most tenacious move here may very well be the move knight h4. And I told him after the game, this move I was really, really scared about because this knight comes to f5, and all of a sudden I have to worry about the g7 pawn, e7, I have to worry about queen c3 and this type of sightings. And it's also very hard to evict the knight from f5 because I can never go g6 because h6 winds up being hanging. So after knight h4, I pretty much have to allow the knight to f5, and after queen f6, knight f5, this looks extremely scary. One other thing I want to note is that if I do play g6 here, I've weakened the h6 pawn, and I was really wary of sacrifices on g6. So I actually thought a move like rook e1 now would almost be decisive, because I thought now there's a threat of taking on g6 and playing rook e6. And I thought that piece sacrifice with my bishop on b7 and rook on b8 completely out of the game would just be decisive. I might be able to try to hang on with a move like knight f8, which holds the e6 square and the g6 pawn, but in the long run, it's hard to believe this is holdable. So again, this is now a target. The e-file is firmly under white's control. Yeah, this position I'd evaluate as lost. So I was very, very thankful he didn't go for knight h4. Another move, by the way, instead of knight h4 would just be queen e2. And the point is here, again, you're taking control of the e-file, and if I try to go king f8 and challenge for it, there's queen e4, which entertains queen h7, maybe just swings the queen over to the king side, and yeah, just a tough spot to be in. And if knight f6, now queen e5 might even be a good move, threatening to just trade queens and take on b6. So I breathed a sigh of relief when after queen d6, he instead went for bishop f5, because at least this is kind of what I was prepared for with my rook b8 move, was that I could go bishop c8. And while this position is still very passive and not good for black, I thought that I'm closer to maybe trading more pieces and holding the game. White now went queen e2, now shifting gears towards the e-file, but I think it's one move too late, because now I can go knight f6 and cover e8 and threaten to trade these bishops. So I thought, okay, I'm getting closer to holding the game. Bishop takes c8 was played, but I actually think this helps me. I think instead, white should have tried to keep the tension and go bishop c2, and at least just keep some minor pieces on the board. But I can understand why you wouldn't want to allow bishop d7 and rook e8 to come on the board, because it does seem like white would be going backwards. So after bishop takes c8, I played rook takes c8, and now white went for the move queen e5. And I think here white was kind of thinking, well, even though we've traded some pieces, I still have a serious space advantage. The b6 pawn is still a target, and endgames still favor me given the space. And I agreed. I think white is still better here, but trading pieces is really not the way to prosecute this advantage, because I don't have a lot of activity, and so, you kind of want to keep some pieces on the board given my lack of activity. And so instead, a better move would have been g3. And the point is with g3 is that you introduce this knight h4, knight f5 idea potentially, but you also stop my queen from maneuvering to f4, where it might actually get counterplay on c4. And you might say, well, what about the e-file? What about a move like rook e8 that now controls the e-file? Well, it's only temporary, because now the queen can jump to b2, and I pretty much would have to go right back to defend this pawn. So I'm not really buying my play here on the e-file right now at all. Maybe black could play knight d7 here actually, but even so, I'm still skeptical of black's chances here to hold. Anyways, after queen e5, I calculated for a while and I thought, yeah, I don't really want to take on e5 because my b6 pawn would hang and it would be extremely dangerous. And I actually found a very, very nice resourceful move, the move knight e8. And my point is that if we're going to trade on d6, it's going to be on my terms, hopefully. And with my knight on d6, I actually get counterplay on the c4 pawn. So the point is that if you actually, well, he actually played queen f5, but if you take on d6, after knight takes d6, rook takes b6, knight takes c4, I thought after rook takes a6 there would be enough to draw here with the move rook d8. And the point is I'm picking up the pawn on d5. It can't be defended again. And I thought my knight and my rook would be able to corral the a pawn eventually, especially with the move like rook d1 check, maybe getting behind the a pawn. I would still need some precise moves to hold, but I thought I would hold it. So yeah, that was my idea with knight e8. So white decided to play queen f5 and agreed with me that this endgame would probably be drawn, and decided to challenge this rook on c8, which is reasonable. And now I played a mistake, unfortunately. I should have gone for the move rook b8, just reinforcing the b pawn. But instead, I got a little bit ambitious and thought that maybe there was some world where my rook can actually get to e7 and challenge the one open file. So I went for rook c7, but this was actually extremely misguided because it's just a little bit awkward here, and this maneuver is not particularly realistic. Instead, rook b8 would have been the move. White now played queen e5, and fortunately this gave me the opportunity to correct my mistake. But instead of queen e5, White had a really, really big time move which took advantage of the awkwardness of rook c7. Why don't you pause the video and try to figure out this move, which is a nearly winning move. It gives an advantage close to winning for White. Alright, the move that White could play here that would be really spectacular and really loosen the screws is the move a5. And the issue with a5 is that the b6 pawn is hanging and I'm pretty much obliged to take. Note that I can't defend it now with rook b7 because queen c8 is a problem. Well, maybe not right away, but definitely queen c8 would be a problem. And probably after like something like takes first, takes, now queen c8 looks really problematic. And because of that, I need to take on a5. But now the 8th rank is very loose because of my rook c7 move. And rook b8 is just a crusher because now this pin is really tough to deal with. I could go rook e7, but now White has rook c8. And if White is able to secure the c5 pawn, the two connected pass pawns are just easily winning. My doubled A pawns are not going anywhere. So even though White is temporarily a pawn down, I'm just completely tied up. And the line could continue like a4, queen c2. But the point is that, yeah, I'm just totally tied up, and this is not a position that is really playable. Thankfully, he played queen e5, and I went rook c8 back. And here I was really gonna play rook b8 this time around because I thought, yeah, allowing a5 was something I was not supposed to do. So after rook c8, White actually went queen b2, and this actually forced rook b8, but I was going to do it anyway. Yeah, after rook b8, I thought, okay, I've held things together, and I've managed to trade a few pieces, and I'm still worse, but I'm hanging in there. I just need to fix my knight now. Now, it actually turns out that this move that I thought was forced, rook b8, is actually not forced, and a better move would have been queen f4, trying to go active and getting counterplay on the c-pawn. But I thought in time trouble, which I was in, I just didn't really think I should play this actively. I kind of wanted to hold things together because I was a little bit concerned about a position like this where my rook has to make a tough decision, and it still seemed like White was kind of active on f7. It turns out here that after rook d8, though, the d5 pawn is just dropping. So White actually needs to play queen f7, king f7, knight e5 check, and this little fork tactic, basically creates a position that's close to equal. But, yeah, even this one, White has a little bit of an annoying position because he can kind of check me and harass me and, at least force my king to make some decision because, of course, I can't go to f6 because of a fork. And I go back to d8, and that's very passive. So even here, White has a little bit of pressure. Anyways, though, I did go rook b8. And now White went in for with knight e5, and here I realized that I wasn't out of the woods yet because all of a sudden this knight can come to c6 and is really, really annoying. And yeah, again, knights in the opponent's territory like this is really just, they do a great job of controlling the rook's access to its own squares in the 8th rank. So always be wary of a knight that's in your camp on the 6th rank because it's really a problem. After knight e5, I went rook b7, which was prophylaxis against knight c6. And now White went knight c6 anyway, which is a good move. And I really have to be careful here because I'm lacking coordination. My rook and knight are both unprotected. And yeah, it's a tough spot. I now went queen f4, trying to get active and entertaining the idea from a few moves ago, but also introducing knight d6 as well. And I thought that if I get in queen at knight d6, I thought, wow, I'm going to, maybe turn the tables if he doesn't find a good move here. But of course, this was a little bit ambitious thinking, because I realized after white's next move, there's no way I could win. And the move that white played was knight d8. And after knight d8, I realized, oh my gosh, this is like a completely cold shower, because I have to go back to b8, because otherwise my b6 pawn is hanging. And at the very least, after rook b8, there's knight c6 with a repetition, but maybe he might have more. So after rook d7, I attack that knight from there, and after knight c6, I went rook b7, and then here, white could have really made a very, very strong move instead of repeating that would have put the game firmly in his grasp. And the move, believe it or not, that he could have played but did not play is actually the move queen c1. And queen c1 is completely paradoxical, because I've talked about how the space was so important to white's position, and how, keeping that space and keeping pieces on the board were the best way to go. But believe it or not, after queen takes c1 and rook takes c1, this position is so difficult to play, even with my knight blockading beautifully on d6. And the problem is that I can never actually play b5, which I thought I would be able to play. I actually was probably going to play this move, and the issue is it just loses on the spot. And the reason for that is after a move like king f1 and b5, white can actually play c takes b5, and after a takes b5, I thought, well, we'll just draw with rook takes c5 and b takes a4. But actually, a5 here is completely winning. And it all has to do with this monster knight on the 6th rank, because all of a sudden, this pawn just is shuttled down the board very, very easily to queen. And so if I go knight c8 to try and stop it from advancing, white still goes a6. And note that my rook cannot come back to b8 because the knight controls the square. So if I go for a move like rook b6, white now just goes rook a1. And you could see here that this pawn will queen, or the black will have to give up the knight. So it actually turns out that these endgames with the queen trade are just very, very unpleasant. And since I can't push b5, I just have to kind of hunker down and wait. But it's hard to imagine with the rook being so passive here, this knight so active, and then this rook free to roam, and white could also take more space on the king side, that this position would be held. And so I actually believe this position is strategically lost for black. So I was very, very fortunate that after rook b7, white now played knight a5, still repeating. And after a few more repetitions, we actually agreed to a draw here. Very, very interesting game. I think it was, especially because it was my first Queen's Indian with black. I thought, it's always nice to play a new opening. You get a little bit of energy from it. It's almost like a basketball team having a different starting lineup. It just the energy is different, and it's makes things a little bit fresh. So it was nice to play a line that I don't normally play, but I definitely need to be a little bit more alert and wary of, passed pawns in the center, and particularly protected passed pawns, because I really missed that he could just advance with d5 in the middle. And my bishop was shut out on b7, and I really was I was really in a bad spot, basically. So to put it mildly. So very, very fortunate to have escaped. I think I did manage to get enough counterplay, in particular with my queen getting active all of a sudden on f4, but I still was not playing the type of game I wanted to play, and the last two rounds had not gone particularly well for me. So happy to escape with a draw, but my play overall was not good enough, and I was hoping to play better in the last round. Alright, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.